Greetings, Star Warriors. Welcome to the Outer Rim. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. You all know how I like to read articles and refute what is in them. Well, today I am going to be refuting a fellow YouTube film critic. Well, I'm not a film critic in general, but he is. And he is also a self-fashioned Star Wars fan. Let me introduce you to him.
I believe Lucasfilm and Disney, and remember, you're talking to the world's biggest fan of the original trilogy of Star Wars. There's nobody who's there are certainly numbers of people out there who are as big of a fan as me. You ain't going to find anybody out there who's a bigger fan than me of the original trilogy of Star Wars. You know this.
Okay, folks, some of you may have recognized his voice. That is John Campea, formerly of AMC Movie Talk, formerly of Collider Movie Talk. He now is running his own YouTube channel. And, as he said, he is a large Star Wars fan. But then why am I concerned about what John Campea does or says? With great power comes great responsibility, but what message has John Campea been using his power to spread? Well, let's find out, shall we?
Star Wars needs to Lucasfilm needs to start looking beyond the original fan base of Star Wars for the good of the franchise.
Okay, so right from the outset, I think all of us probably have the same questions on our mind. Why would someone who professes to be a fan of the original trilogy say this? Why would a company and a franchise that has always known nothing but success need to look beyond the fans that carried it into that success? Well, let's see if John Campea has an answer.
And some might say, but John, fans of the original are how we got this successful. Yes, I'm not denying that. I'm one of those fans. But that's not going to sustain you for the next 20 years. Disney wants this thing like Paramount wants Star Trek to exist for another 30, 40, 50 years. If Disney wants to not be short-sighted and just look at what will work for the next 2 to 3 years, but rather look at what will set us up for success for the next 15 years, for the next 20 years, they have to start looking at not just pandering to me. They can no longer just pander to me.
Okay, so now we're getting somewhere. Everyone noticed how John Campea mentioned Star Trek there. So in a certain way, he's conflating Star Trek with Star Wars. And that's going to be a running theme throughout his narrative here. The problem with John Campea's ideas are that he compares Star Wars with Star Trek, but he never attempts to contrast the two. So at least where this issue is concerned, you're only going to get half the story from John Campea, or maybe even less than half. We'll have to see.
Star Wars The Last Jedi all by itself is $1.3 billion. It's kind of a weird number to put into context there. But at any rate, let's look at Star Trek. Star Trek was a popular franchise. It moved into the movies with some success. But what we started to see happening in Star Trek, and I remember I made a number of videos about this before the first J.J. Abrams Star Trek movie came out, which is simply this. Star Trek was literally a dying franchise. It had been around forever, and the original fan base was literally dying off. You had people who were fans of the original Star Trek, and they were dying. And they were not being replaced with a new generation of fans.
Okay, so right about now, I'm going to start with the first problem I see in his comparison. Star Trek was never conceived originally to be a feature film. It was conceived as a TV show, and it was a rather popular one. But when a decade after it was conceived as a TV show, it had its time in the sun, it went out of the sun, and it was gone for 10 years. In comes the success of another space franchise, a movie, Star Wars, and Star Trek reacts to that success. And all of a sudden, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy and the rest are all ported over to the big screen. That's all well and good, but you're only going to have a modicum of Star Wars' success by porting over characters who were meant for the little screen to the big screen. And then the next time Star Wars or Star Trek shows up, it shows up pretty much in a TV show, and it has great success in The Next Generation. A TV show, not a movie. And of course, The Next Generation, same thing. They had several movies and they did okay. But they were designed for the small screen. But let's see how John Campea sort of slithers past these facts.
In Star Trek, they faced this conundrum that they had this universe, it was dying in popularity, they were like, literally some of their original fans were dying off, and they were not adding a new generation of fans. New fans were not coming along. Let's look at the box office numbers. This just kind of illustrates the point.
And now John Campea mentions the Star Trek box office numbers, and we already discussed why those are pretty much irrelevant. Not only does he ignore inflation and growth in population for his narrative, basically he talks about how Star Trek box office numbers were pretty successful at some point, but all they did is drop as they kept pandering to the fans over the decades. He never really even mentions too much how Star Trek didn't rely on the original cast, but they actually did as many movies almost, maybe even more, with the Next Generation cast. There are actual websites out there that catalog what each Star Trek movie would have made with inflation in mind, and it's nowhere near as bad as John Campea suggested would be. In fact, I might put them both side by side on the screen as I put up a dialogue of him talking about the box office numbers.
So we go from Star Trek Nemesis making $43 million domestically at the box office to Star Trek, the first J.J. Abrams movie in 2009, 7 years later, making $257 million. And each of the two movies after that have made significantly more than any of the Star Trek movies that came before it, with Into Darkness making $228 and Star Trek Beyond making $158 million. Now, you can make an argument there's a little bit of a downward trajectory there, for sure. But even with its downward trajectory, Star Trek Beyond made nearly double what any of the previous Star Trek movies did.
Now, this is what happens when a man's wallet becomes more important than his integrity. I must, before I start talking about the box office and everything, I must state that John Campea is a Star Wars fan. According to him, Star Wars is what got him into his love for movies or his desire to become a film critic. But also, he was a prequel basher. I mean, he still takes, the odd opportunity to bash him to this day. But he does like films such as The Man of Steel, Batman vs. Superman. He likes Justice League. I think he mentioned a few days ago that he saw Justice League in the theaters 6 times. And he loves The Last Jedi. Now, I must also be sure that I make clear that John Campea was invited to the very exclusive world premiere of The Last Jedi. He's a Hollywood insider. He gets to hobnob with a bunch of stars. At least he has in the past when he was with AMC Movie Talk and Collider Movie Talk. He was rubbing shoulders with these important people. Back in the days when the prequels came out, I don't believe he was rubbing shoulders with anyone at Lucasfilm. Or I'm not sure if he was a professional film critic at all at that point. So all this stuff is important before we get to talking about the box office. Now, if you listen to John Campea, you would believe that J.J. Abrams' Star Trek movies completely outpaced all of the other Star Trek movies combined at the box office. As we look at the chart that is adjusted for inflation, we can tell that J.J. Abrams' movies are coming in 4th is his best one. 4th to Star Trek the Motion Picture. 4th to The Voyage Home. 4th to Star Trek. But after Into Darkness, there's The Wrath of Khan. I thought that would have done much better, but J.J. Abrams' movies are not doing any better than the movies from the 80s, the movies from the 90s. Well, maybe than some of the movies from the 90s, but they're not doing nearly as well as John Campea would have you believe. Okay, so what's the deal with all this talk about inflation? Why is that important? Well, I just so happens that I have another chart here, and it catalogs the federal minimum wage and the U.S. population for the last couple decades and how they have changed. And while the minimum wage is not the greatest way to measure inflation, it does give you some idea of what a large part of the population was making at the time. And it shows 1978, minimum wage was $2.30. There were 225 million people in the U.S. In 1989, minimum wage rocketed to $3.35, a whole $1.05 over 10 years' time. And the population in the U.S. at that time was 246 million people. So they'd gained 21 million people. In 1999, we had an even larger jump in the minimum wage. It went up to $5.15. And the U.S. population, 279 million people. And blah, blah, blah. You get the trend. Today, the minimum wage is $7.25, and there are roughly 325 million people in the United States. And these numbers are relevant because the more people there are, the more a movie is going to earn at the box office. That's probably the largest reason why China is now gaining on the United States as one of the largest box office markets in the world. And by 2019, it is estimated that they will surpass the U.S. as the largest box office market in the world because they have so many people. And of course, as inflation becomes a factor, we know that the dollar becomes worth less, and people have to use more money to purchase things such as movie tickets. So the movie will end up making more money than it would have in the 1980s or the 1990s or even the early 2000s. So what does John Campea have to say about all of this?
They needed to make some changes, and they needed to adopt a philosophy that they were no longer just going to pander their stuff to the original fans, because sticking on that course, while it had success in the past, was eventually going to kill the franchise. They didn't spit in the face of the original fans. They still made it recognizably Star Trek, but they realized we can no longer make Star Trek films that simply pander to the original fans. Because we've been doing that for decades and our damn property's been dying.
Whoa there, John. Calm down, bucko. As stated earlier, Star Trek was always meant to be a TV show. And the films would never kill the franchise. It would never kill, as long as they kept making TV shows, Star Trek would be fine. Now, if the TV shows actually ever came under fire, it would have nothing to do with what characters they used. They went to Picard in The Next Generation. They went to Sisko in Deep Space Nine. They went to Janeway in Voyager. Then they went to Scott Bakula. I never even watched the Enterprise one. But they went to several different ones. If they were in trouble, it had nothing to do with pandering to the original fans. Just as if Star Wars ever got into trouble, it would have nothing to do with their pandering to the original fans. Which Star Wars has never been in trouble financially or otherwise. Which is why Star Wars is not a one-to-one comparison to Star Trek. Star Wars and Star Trek are both very well-established franchises, and if they got into trouble, it would be for many reasons, but mostly it would probably have something to do with terrible writing, terrible ideas. That's what usually gets fictional franchises into trouble. Special effects, they're easy. Any bad franchise can get good special effects as long as someone is there with the money to pay for them. Good stories, good writing, that's harder to come by. But still, John is not ready to give up on his argument.
There are people out there who aren't interested in Star Wars. They're interested in Luke Skywalker. In particular, the Luke Skywalker specifically that they remember from 3 decades ago.
Right. Would all 8 such people please stand up? I mean, who are these people, and why are you considering them among Star Wars fans? They're not the people being spoken about at this moment. There's no one like that who matters to this discussion. Take note, folks. That was how someone talks when he knows most writers in Hollywood suck, but it would be against his interests to say so publicly. And as always, if you're listening, you are the new rebellion. 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 You are